He didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part that cut deepest. Gerald Whitmore sat high on his horse, his silver watch chain catching the last light of a Wyoming afternoon, and he pointed one thick finger at Eliza Rowan like she was a fence post he'd decided to move. "This girl," he announced to anyone within earshot on that dusty main street, "is a thief. She took $40 from my household accounts and disappeared in the night like the rat she is." He smiled when he said it. Actually smiled. "Anyone who shelters her is a fool, and anyone who believes her is worse." Eliza stood in the dirt with nowhere to run. She had nothing. No horse, no bag, no coin in her pocket, just the dress on her back and a truth that nobody in this town was going to believe. And somewhere behind her, she could hear a baby crying. That sound, that one small, desperate sound, was the thing that stopped her feet from moving. She turned toward it before she even knew she was turning. If you've ever had someone take everything from you and smile while they did it, stay with me, because this story is about what happens next. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. These are the stories that stay with you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1887, and meet a woman who had every reason to give up, and didn't. The baby had been crying for most of the day. That was the truth nobody in Harder's Crossing wanted to talk about, because talking about it meant acknowledging that Caleb Ashford was drowning, and people out here on the frontier didn't like to see a man drown. It made them uncomfortable. It reminded them of how thin the line was between holding on and letting go. Caleb was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that had broken wild horses and repaired collapsed barn roofs in February blizzards. He was the kind of man people pointed to when they wanted to say, "That's what this land makes. Hard, capable, built to last." But for the past 9 days, he had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. His eyes had gone the color of ash. He moved through the hours of each day like a man walking underwater, slow, heavy, everything muffled. The cabin smelled like sour milk and wood smoke and something else underneath, something he couldn't name, something that was just grief with no place left to go. His wife Margaret had died on the 8th of October. Owen had come into the world screaming at 3 in the morning, and Margaret had left it just before dawn, quietly, the way she'd always done everything, without making a fuss, without complaint, as though dying were just another chore she was managing to get through without bothering anyone. Caleb had held Owen that first morning and looked down at this red, furious, helpless face and felt, and this was the thing he would never say out loud to another living soul, he had felt the wrong kind of thing, not hatred, nothing that simple, just a vast, terrible blankness, like standing at the edge of a field after a fire has gone through it. Everything you'd expected to see, gone. He'd fed the baby. He'd changed him. He'd walked circles around the inside of that cabin at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning, while Owen screamed with what seemed like personal accusation, as though the child already knew and was already furious about it. 9 days of this. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles east. She'd come twice with food and advice, and a kind expression that Caleb couldn't bear to look at directly, because kindness right now felt like being handed a glass of water when what you needed was a river. He thanked her. She left. He kept walking circles. He'd gone into town that afternoon not because he needed supplies. He didn't, not urgently, but because the cabin walls had started to feel like they were leaning inward. He'd loaded Owen into the sling Margaret had sewn from old flour sacks, and he'd hitched the wagon and driven the 7 miles to Harder's Crossing just to be somewhere with other human beings, even if he had nothing to say to them. Owen cried for most of the ride. Caleb said nothing. What was there to say? He tied the horse in front of McAllister's general store and went in to buy flour and lamp oil and a block of salt, and Owen fussed and squirmed against his chest the entire time, and old Roy McAllister watched him from behind the counter with that same unbearable expression of sympathetic helplessness, and Caleb paid and thanked him and walked back out into the afternoon light, and that was when he heard it. The voice. Loud. Certain. Carrying across the street with the practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "This girl is a thief." Oh, Caleb stopped walking because Owen suddenly went quiet. He didn't know why the baby went quiet. He'd learned by now that there was no pattern to it, no logic he could extract. Owen cried, and then Owen stopped crying, and the reasons were mostly a mystery. But in that moment, the sudden silence was striking enough that Caleb turned, following the direction of his son's attention, because infants, he'd discovered, noticed things adults had learned to ignore. What Owen was looking at, or what Caleb imagined he was looking at, was a young woman standing in the middle of the street. She was maybe 23, 24, slim, dark hair pulling loose from a braid that had clearly been neat some hours ago. Her dress was clean but worn at the elbows and hem, the kind of clean that takes serious effort when you're living rough. She was standing very still in a way that looked like stillness but wasn't. It was the stillness of a person who has learned that running only makes things worse. Across from her, Gerald Whitmore was still talking. Caleb knew Gerald Whitmore. Everybody in this part of Wyoming knew Gerald Whitmore. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, sat on the town council, donated money to the church at Christmas with the specific energy of a man who wanted to be seen donating. He had a handshake that lasted a half-second too long, and eyes that watched you with a kind of permanent calculation, pricing you out. Right now he was telling a small but attentive crowd that the young woman in front of him had stolen from his household and fled, and that she was not to be trusted, and that anyone who helped her was enabling criminal behavior. The crowd was listening. That was what crowds out here did when Gerald Whitmore spoke. They listened, and they tilted in the direction he was pointing. Caleb watched the young woman's face while Whitmore talked. She wasn't crying. That surprised him. He'd half expected tears. That seemed like the obvious response to public accusation, at least in his limited observation. But she wasn't crying. She was listening to every word with this expression he couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between exhaustion and something harder, something that had been forged over a longer period of difficulty than a single afternoon. When Whitmore finished, she said quietly, "That's not what happened." "She speaks," Whitmore said, with the kind of smile that made the word into a weapon. "I'll speak," she said, "and then you can think whatever you like." That was the moment Caleb started paying closer attention. He didn't go over there. Not yet. He stood where he was, Owen against his chest, and he watched while the young woman tried to tell her side of a story to an audience that had already made up its mind. Her name was Eliza Rowan. She said it plainly, like she wasn't ashamed of it. She'd come to work at the Whitmore Ranch 8 months ago as a domestic worker, cooking and cleaning, sending what wages she could back to her younger sister in Colorado. She'd been good at the work. She'd kept her head down. Then the foreman, a man named Holt, had decided he wanted something she wasn't offering. She didn't use soft language about it. She said, he made clear what he wanted, and when she refused, he made her life at that ranch impossible. Spoiled work she'd already done. Accused her of carelessness in front of Whitmore. When she went to Whitmore himself, Holt had already been there first, with a story prepared. He told Mr. Whitmore I'd been stealing from the household accounts, she said. By the time I had a chance to speak, my things were already on the porch. An interesting story, Whitmore said, with no evidence whatsoever. There's rarely evidence when powerful men do things quietly, she said, and the crowd shifted, uncomfortable, the way crowds do when something true gets said in public. Caleb thought, she's not wrong. He also thought, this is not going well for her, because the crowd's discomfort wasn't going to translate into action on her behalf. It never did. The discomfort would pass. Whitmore's money and position wouldn't. By tomorrow morning, this young woman would be what she already looked like. Someone passing through, someone with no anchor here, someone it was easier to ignore. He should unhitch his wagon and go home. Owen had started fussing again, small, frustrated sounds building towards something larger. Caleb put his hand flat against the baby's back, the way he'd seen Margaret do, and Owen paused, as though considering whether to escalate. And in that pause, Caleb looked up and found the young woman looking directly at him. Not at the crowd, not at Whitmore, at Caleb, at Owen, pressed against Caleb's chest. And her expression changed, not dramatically, not the way it would change in a theater production, just a small, almost involuntary shift, like something in her face recognized something in what she saw. She looked at that baby the way someone looks at a thing they understand. Whitmore was done with the spectacle. He turned his horse, spoke a few quiet words to the men beside him, and rode out of the street like he'd already forgotten she existed, which was, Caleb thought, the most efficient form of cruelty. Not anger, but dismissal. Anger at least acknowledged you were worth the energy. The crowd dissolved. That was what crowds did. They were held together by the event, and when the event ended, they remembered they had other places to be. Within 3 minutes, the street was ordinary again, and Eliza Rowan was standing in the dirt alone. Caleb should have left. He told himself this clearly. He had a baby and a half-empty ranch and more grief than he knew where to put, and the last thing he needed was someone else's complicated situation. He was barely managing his own. He should go home. He walked across the street. "You have anywhere to go tonight?" he said. She looked at him without expression. "Does it matter?" "Probably not the right question," he admitted. "I apologize." That seemed to disarm her slightly. People out here didn't often lead with apologies. "No," she said. "I don't have anywhere to go." Owen, for reasons that defied all logic Caleb had assembled in 9 days of desperate observation, had gone completely quiet. He was looking at Eliza Rowan with the focused attention of a creature who has not yet learned that staring is impolite. "He's staring at you, Shem," Caleb said, because he didn't know what else to say. "I know." She looked at Owen, and something in her face did that small shift again. "He's beautiful." "He cries constantly." "I know," she said again. "I could hear him from the other end of the street." They stood there for a moment. Caleb, who was a man most comfortable with silence, found that this particular silence felt different from the silence of his cabin. The cabin silence was the kind that pressed on you. This was something else. "I have a ranch 7 miles out," he said. I'm not offering anything. I don't know what I'm offering. My wife died 9 days ago." She looked at him directly when he said it. No flinching, no practiced sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said, and it sounded like she meant it specifically, not generally. "I can't pay wages right now. The fall has been hard. I'm not asking for wages." "I'm not suggesting you should work for nothing either." "I'm not suggesting that either," she said. "I'm just—" She stopped, looked at Owen again. "Let me hold him." It wasn't a question exactly. Caleb, who had not let anyone hold Owen except the neighbor woman, found himself, without any conscious decision, shifting the baby toward her. She took him with the practiced ease of someone who had held babies before, settled him against her shoulder, and began a slow, rhythmic motion that was not quite walking and not quite rocking, but something between the two. Owen stopped crying. Not gradually. Not winding down. Just stopped. The silence hit Caleb in the chest like something physical. "How did you do that?" he said. "I helped raise my sister," Eliza said. "She cried like this. It's not the crying that's the problem, it's the loneliness. They can feel when the person holding them is frightened. You've been frightened for 9 days." He had no answer to that because it was completely accurate. She looked up at him over Owen's head. "Let me stay," she said. "I'll raise your son." The most honest thing he could have said was, "I have no idea how to say yes to that and no idea how to say no." What he actually said was, "You'd better come see the place first." The drive out to the ranch was mostly quiet. Owen slept against Eliza's arm. Caleb drove and tried to organize his thoughts into something that resembled a reasonable plan, and failed. He kept thinking about what she'd said. They can feel when the person holding them is frightened. He had been frightened. He was still frightened. He was frightened of the winter coming, frightened of the silence in the cabin, frightened of this child who needed things from him that he didn't know how to give. He was frightened of the mornings most of all. That moment each day when he woke up and there was a half second before he remembered, and then he remembered. He thought about the way Whitmore had smiled when he said the word thief, that particular satisfaction. The smile of a man who has decided the story and is pleased with how it reads. "How long were you traveling before you got to town today?" he asked. 3 days, she said. "On foot?" "On foot." He thought about that. 3 days on foot in October in Wyoming. He looked at her shoes without being obvious about it. They were in bad condition. "You should have said something," he said. About my shoes? About being tired. You didn't ask, she said, without hostility, just factually. I'm asking now. She was quiet for a moment. I'm very tired, she said. I've been very tired for a long time. He nodded. That was another thing he understood perfectly. When they pulled up to the ranch, the sun was going down behind the mountains, and the cabin sat in the half-dark looking. He could see it fresh through someone else's eyes, looking rough. The porch railing he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months had finally given up and lay against the side of the house. The garden was spent and ragged. One of the barn doors hung at an angle. It needs work, he said. Everything does, she said, and climbed down from the wagon with Owen still sleeping in her arms and walked toward the front door like she'd been here before. He followed her, and he couldn't have explained why. Not then, not afterward, but something in how she walked toward that broken-down porch, steady and without hesitation, made the thing in his chest that had been clenched tight since the 8th of October loosen, just fractionally, just enough that he could take a full breath. He hadn't taken a full breath in 9 days. He didn't know yet what was coming. He didn't know about the months ahead, the long process of learning another person's patterns, the mistakes, the misunderstandings, the specific friction of 2 grieving people and 1 small child trying to figure out how to be something that worked. He didn't know about Gerald Whitmore's next move, which was coming, and which would be worse than what had happened in the street. He just stood on his own porch and watched a stranger carry his son inside and thought, something just changed. He didn't know if it was good or bad. He wasn't sure it mattered. He just knew that the silence in the cabin tonight was going to be different from the silence of the last 9 nights. And right now, different was the only thing he had left to want. He picked up the fallen porch railing and leaned it against the wall and went inside. Behind him, the Wyoming dark came down over everything, quiet and enormous and indifferent, the way it always had, the way it always would. But inside, there was a lamp lit. The first morning, Caleb woke up before dawn and lay still for a full minute, listening for Owen's crying before he remembered there was someone else in the house now. The silence felt different, not the hollow kind he'd been living in. Something occupied it. He got up anyway, the way he always had, pulled on his boots in the dark, and walked out to start the stove. Eliza was already there. She had the fire going and was standing at the counter with her back to him, doing something with the flour sack he'd bought yesterday. She didn't startle when he came in, didn't turn around immediately, just said, "Coffee's not ready yet, 10 minutes," the way someone says it when they've been up for a while and have already made their peace with the morning. He sat down at the table and watched the back of her head and tried to figure out what he was supposed to say. He'd spent 9 days talking to nobody except Owen, and before that he'd spent months talking mostly to Margaret, who had known his silences well enough to know which ones needed filling and which ones didn't. He had no idea what category Eliza Rowan operated in. "How'd you sleep?" he said finally. "Fine." A pause. "The cot's a little short." "I can look at that." "It's fine," she said, which was not the same as saying it didn't matter, but seemed to be all she was going to say about it. Owen started making sounds from the back room, not crying yet, just the preliminary noises, the warming up. Eliza wiped her hands on a cloth and moved before Caleb had even pushed his chair back. He sat there and listened to her voice, low and even, talking to the baby in the other room, and the preliminary noises stopped. He sat with that for a moment. Then he got up and went out to start on the horses. This was how the first week went. Not smoothly, that would be the wrong word for it. More like 2 people in a room who are both trying very hard not to be in each other's way, and sometimes succeeding and sometimes not. Caleb moved around the cabin with the particular caution of a man who has lived alone long enough that another person's presence registers almost as a physical intrusion. Not unwelcome exactly, but startling, like a sound in a room you thought was empty. He burned the eggs on Tuesday morning because he forgot she was there and came into the kitchen while she was managing Owen and without thinking took over at the stove, then got distracted watching her and let the pan go too long. She said nothing about the eggs. She ate them. So did he. They were both quiet about it in the specific way of people who are choosing their battles early. On Wednesday, she asked him where Margaret kept the mending supplies. He told her. Then he went and stood in the barn for about 20 minutes doing nothing in particular, just standing there with his hand on a horse's neck, breathing. The horse didn't ask questions. He wasn't angry. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He understood that Margaret's things had to be used or they had to be put away, and leaving them exactly where they were wasn't actually preserving anything except his own avoidance. He understood this intellectually. Emotionally, it felt like someone reaching through a wall into a room he'd sealed off, not to steal anything, just to make it real. He went back inside and showed Eliza where the rest of the supplies were. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said. Neither of them elaborated. By the end of that first week, certain things had established themselves without being discussed. Eliza handled Owen's mornings and midday feedings while Caleb worked the ranch. Caleb handled the livestock and the heavy repairs. Meals were a joint, somewhat chaotic effort that neither of them had formally agreed to, but that seemed to happen anyway, out of proximity and practical necessity. In the evenings, after Owen went down, they sat in the main room, Caleb usually with something that needed mending or sharpening, Eliza sometimes reading the one shelf of books that had belonged to Margaret, sometimes just sitting. And the silence between them gradually changed its character from something tense and watchful to something closer to neutral. Not comfortable. Neutral. There's a difference. What Caleb noticed slowly, the way you notice water rising rather than a sudden flood, was that he was sleeping. Not well. Not through the night, but more than 2 hours at a stretch, which was enough that the edges of things started coming back into focus. He noticed the sky in the mornings again. He noticed that the porch railing was still leaning against the side of the house, and that he should actually fix it rather than just thinking about fixing it. He fixed it on Saturday. Took about 2 hours. When he came in afterward, there was cornbread on the table, and Owen was sitting propped in the corner of the armchair with a rolled blanket on each side of him, watching the room with his serious, unfocused eyes. Caleb sat down across from his son, and they looked at each other. "He looks like her," Eliza said from the kitchen doorway. "Around the eyes." He hadn't told her anything about Margaret. She must have been looking at the photograph on the shelf, the one from the year they married, the only photograph either of them had ever been in. He should have found this intrusive. He found it, instead, like a small pressure releasing somewhere in his rib cage. "Yeah," he said. "He does." She didn't push it. Went back into the kitchen. He sat with his son, and the cornbread went cold while he looked at Owen's eyes and thought about that. The second week brought rain, 3 days of it, the kind of cold, driving October rain that makes the Wyoming landscape look like it's trying to dissolve. The barn roof had a leak that Caleb had been putting off for 2 months, and in the rain it became urgent. He spent most of a day up there in weather he had no business being in, and came back inside soaked through and with his right hand cut where a piece of tin sheeting had caught him. Eliza looked at the hand, didn't comment on the weather or the wisdom of the timing, just said, "Sit down," and got the kit Margaret had kept in the second drawer. She cleaned the cut with more efficiency than gentleness. It stung badly enough that he made a sound he immediately regretted, and wrapped it with linen and secured it with the particular knot that he'd always had trouble with himself. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he said. "Ranch work," she said. "You cut yourself constantly on ranches. You either learn or you get infected and lose the hand." "That's an efficient way of thinking about it." "The frontier's efficient," she said, "but that's the one thing it's good at." He flexed his hand experimentally, the knot held. He looked at it for a moment, then at her, and she'd already moved on to putting the kit away, her back to him, completely matter-of-fact. He thought, I don't actually know anything about her. He knew what she'd said in the street, which was a version of her story shaped for a hostile audience, probably strategic in what it included and didn't include. He knew she was capable and quick and had no tolerance for being coddled. He knew she'd been on the road for some time before Harder's Crossing, and that those shoes of hers had finally given up entirely. He'd found them by the door 2 days ago, and the sole of the right one was almost completely separated. He'd put a pair of Margaret's boots out without saying anything, slightly too large, and they'd disappeared from the doorway, and that had been the entirety of that transaction. What he didn't know was where she'd grown up, or what her life had been before the Whitmore Ranch, or whether she had people somewhere who were looking for her or worrying. He didn't know if she was in legal trouble beyond Whitmore's accusation, or whether there were other complications following her. He didn't know, and she hadn't offered, and he hadn't asked because asking felt like it would constitute a kind of claim. Like, if he knew her history, he'd have to decide something about it, hold it somehow, and he wasn't sure he had the capacity for that right now. But sitting at his table with his wrapped hand in his lap, he thought, I should ask. Eliza. She turned. You have family somewhere? Something shifted in her expression. Not much. A sister, she said, in Colorado. Younger. She know where you are? Not exactly. A pause. I sent a letter from the last town. Told her I was traveling. She'll worry. Worries regardless, Eliza said, with an affection in her voice that surprised him by how unguarded it sounded. Like for a second she'd forgotten to keep the measured quality she usually maintained. She was born worrying. I think she came out of the womb already concerned about something. He almost smiled, caught himself. You should write to her. I know. She looked at her hands. I didn't want to tell her I'd ended up in this situation. Staying at a widower's ranch? Being accused of theft and chased out of a job. She said it flatly, without self-pity, but he could hear the thing underneath it. Not shame exactly, but a kind of weariness with having to explain circumstances that weren't her fault to people who would always wonder if some piece of it was. Write to her, he said again. Tell her you're somewhere safe. You don't have to explain the rest. She looked at him for a moment. Are you always this direct? Margaret used to say I was tactful as a fence post. This time she did almost smile. It was brief and somewhat reluctant, but it was there. I'll write to her, she said. The rain kept on. Owen developed a small cough. Nothing serious, just the dampness getting into everything. And Eliza sat up with him 2 nights running, which meant Caleb slept those nights without interruption for the first time in weeks, and woke both mornings feeling like a man who had briefly, imperfectly rejoined the living. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. The gratitude and the guilt arrived together, which was something he was getting used to. On the 3rd week, Dorothy Crane came to call. Dorothy was the neighbor woman who had come twice in the first 9 days. She was 50, sharp-eyed, genuinely kind in the way that people are who have worked hard for most of their lives, and arrived at the conclusion that cruelty is simply too expensive. She brought a pie, dried apple, which was what there was in October, and she sat in the front room and watched Eliza move around the cabin with an expression Caleb couldn't quite decode. After a while she said, You seem to have found your feet. Trying to, Eliza said. Where are you from originally? Kansas, then Colorado, then around. Dorothy nodded slowly, in the way of a woman who is filing information rather than judging it. You do good work, she said. Owen looks better than I've seen him. He's a good baby, Eliza said. He wasn't, Dorothy said gently but honestly. For a while there he wasn't. Caleb was running on nothing. She looked at Caleb across the room. He looked back, prepared to be addressed more directly, but she'd already returned to Eliza. It's good you came, Dorothy said. Whatever brought you, it's good you came. Eliza received this with a slight nod, the way she received most positive things, carefully, like something that might need to be returned. After Dorothy left, Caleb said, She means well. I know she does, Eliza said. It wasn't criticism. She was kind. She stopped. You just what? I'm still getting used to people not expecting the worst from me. He understood that. He didn't say so, but he understood it completely from the inside. The trouble came at the end of October. He should have seen it coming. In a small valley, a man like Caleb Ashford taking in a strange woman was going to generate talk, and talk in a small valley generates itself, multiplies, and eventually finds its way back to the person who started it. Gerald Whitmore had not forgotten Harder's crossing Main Street. Gerald Whitmore, in Caleb's experience, didn't forget anything that involved his reputation being complicated. It was Ray Dobbins who came first. Ray owned the feed store, sat on the same town council as Whitmore, and had the particular social function of being the man who delivered bad news while making it sound like neighborly concern. He stopped by on a Wednesday while Caleb was splitting wood and stood at a comfortable distance and talked about weather and cattle prices and the general difficulty of the coming winter, and then carefully, In the voice of a man who hated to bring something up, he said that people were talking. About what? Caleb said, though he already knew. The situation, Ray said. At your house. Caleb set the axe down. What situation is that? The woman, Ray said. Look, nobody's making accusations, Caleb. That's not what this is. What is it then? Ray shifted his weight. It's just that she arrived in town the way she arrived. The circumstances. Whitmore's saying Whitmore's wrong, Caleb said. He said it without heat, which he thought was probably more effective than saying it angrily. He's wrong. And everybody who spent more than 20 minutes thinking about it knows he's wrong. His foreman ran her off the property to cover his own behavior. She's been here 3 weeks, she's taking care of my son, and she's not leaving. Ray blinked. Caleb? We done? People are going to talk. Let them, Caleb said, and picked up the axe. Ray left. Caleb finished the wood. He went inside and didn't mention the conversation to Eliza because he didn't see the point. She didn't need to know that people were talking. She had enough to manage. He was wrong about that. She already knew. Of course she already knew. Women moving through the world as she'd moved through it. On the edge of welcome, dependent on other people's good opinion, carrying a history that could be misread at any moment. Developed a particular sensitivity to the temperature of a room, a street, a community. She'd noticed the way Dorothy Crane had paused fractionally before saying the word good in the sentence about it being good she'd come. She'd noticed the way Roy McAllister didn't meet her eyes the last time Caleb had taken her into town for supplies. She'd been reading the weather of this valley for 3 weeks, and she knew the barometer was dropping. She told him on a Thursday evening, after Owen was asleep and the fire had settled into coals. I think it would be easier for you if I left, she said. He looked up from the boot he was repairing. What? The talk. It's not going to stop. I know what they're saying, or what they're implying, which is worse, because nobody has to commit to anything, and your position in this community... She stopped. You have to live here, Caleb. Owen has to grow up here. He set the boot down. Did someone say something to you? Nobody has to say something to me. I can read a situation. And you think the solution is you leaving? I think the solution is you not losing the goodwill of everyone in this valley over someone who showed up at your gate 3 weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, something moved in the dark. Probably a deer. They came close to the cabin at night this time of year. The coals shifted. You showed up, he said, and my son started sleeping. You showed up, and I started sleeping. The house... He stopped, looked around at it. I was losing this place. Not to debt, to something else. You know what I mean. She did know what he meant. He could tell from the quality of her silence. If you leave, he said, because of something Whitmore is implying, because people in town have decided to speculate without evidence, then I have spent 3 weeks being rebuilt by someone who I turned around and didn't stand up for. He picked the boot back up. That's not who I'm trying to be. A long silence. You might regret saying that, she said. Maybe. I'm not easy to live alongside. No, you're not. He said it without cruelty. Neither am I. We've been managing. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that he couldn't name, not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly. Something more complicated, something that had multiple things in it at once, the way real emotions usually do, rather than the single clean feelings that show up in the simple stories people tell about their own lives. All right, she said. All right, he said. He went back to the boot. She went back to whatever she'd been doing. The coals settled again. Owen slept in the back room, making the small sounds he made in his sleep, and the night outside pressed its dark and enormous weight against the cabin walls, and inside there was still a lamp burning, the same as it had been. But November was coming, and November in Wyoming had ways of testing things. The snow came in the second week of November, earlier than usual and heavier. The kind of snow that arrives with specific intention, 3 feet in 2 days, piling against the barn and packing into drifts against the cabin's north wall. Caleb spent most of those 2 days keeping the livestock alive and the pathways passable, coming in at night so cold his hands took 20 minutes to stop aching. Eliza kept the stove loaded, kept Owen warm. kept hot food ready at hours that changed day to day depending on when Caleb could get back inside. On the second night, she put a bowl of stew in front of him and sat down across the table instead of going back to whatever she'd been doing. And he realized she'd been keeping herself busy specifically not to do this, specifically not to sit across from him in the evening like something that resembled a family. And she'd just run out of tasks. Owen was in the basket on the floor between them, asleep, his small face smooth and unreachable the way sleeping faces are. "He smiled at me today," Eliza said. "A real one, not the gas kind." Caleb looked at his son. "What does a real one look like?" "You'll know," she said. "It's different. The whole face does something." He ate his stew. "How old does he have to be before the real ones start?" "He's about at the edge of it now, 6, 7 weeks, some earlier." "You're sure it wasn't gas?" "It was not gas," she said, with a firmness that almost made him laugh, which startled him enough that he covered it by reaching for the bread. But she saw it. He could tell from the slight change in her expression. Not smug, just something aware. Like she'd been watching for signs of life and had just seen a pulse. He didn't know how to handle being noticed like that. Margaret had always known when to look away, which was a form of love he'd come to depend on. The specific generosity of a person who sees your difficulty and gives you the privacy to have it. Eliza looked directly at things. It was disconcerting. It was also, he was slowly realizing, its own kind of honesty. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "Why'd you really come to Wyoming? Not the long version. Just," she thought about it. Actually thought about it, which he'd come to recognize as one of her consistent qualities. She didn't answer before she'd decided what she actually thought. "Clara got married," she said. "Good man. She didn't need me anymore. And I'd been useful to people for a long time. Useful to my mother before she passed. Useful to Clara. Useful as a worker wherever I went. I thought maybe there was somewhere that needed something I actually—" She stopped. "That sounds worse out loud than it did in my head." "It doesn't," he said. "I thought there was somewhere that needed me for more than my labor," she said. I know how that sounds." He looked at Owen, at the small, sleeping face. "It doesn't sound like anything," he said. "It sounds like a reasonable thing to want." The snow went on outside. The lamp burned between them. Owen slept. Whatever the word was for what was building in that cabin. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't fast, and neither of them was in any position to say it clearly yet, or would be for a long time. It was the particular unhurried accumulation of two people who have been through enough that they've stopped expecting things to be easy and have started paying attention instead. But underneath all of it, working its way toward them from 30 miles west, was Gerald Whitmore's next move. And when it came, it would not be a conversation at a fence post. It would be public, calculated, and intended to leave nothing standing. They just didn't know that yet. Right now there was stew and snow and a baby who had smiled a real smile for the first time and a lamp that was still burning. For now, that was enough. Whitmore's move came on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. Caleb had driven into Harder's Crossing for the first time since the snow, the roads finally passable after a week of hard freeze that had packed the mud down into something a wagon could manage without losing a wheel. He needed lumber for the north wall repair, and a new hinge set for the barn, and Eliza had written a short list of things: thread, lamp oil, dried beans, in her small, precise handwriting, which he'd folded into his coat pocket without comment. He left her with Owen and the ranch and the specific understanding, unspoken but solid by now, that he'd be back before dark. The trouble started at McAllister's. He was loading the lumber onto the wagon bed when he heard his name behind him, not called out. Said, in the particular tone people use when they're speaking about someone and haven't noticed that someone is within earshot. He turned around slowly, the way you do when you're not sure yet whether you want whoever's talking to know you heard them. It was two men from the east side of the valley, Purvis and his brother-in-law, whose name Caleb always forgot, standing outside the hardware store. They stopped talking when they saw him looking. Purvis nodded, the tight-shouldered nod of a man who has just been caught, and they went inside. Caleb finished loading the lumber. At the hardware store, Frank Adler, who had sold him hinges for 11 years and had the social grace of a man who understood that commerce required a minimum of neutrality, handed him the hinge set and his change and said, with more effort than usual, "Cold enough for you?" "Cold enough," Caleb said. Frank looked at the counter. "You hear Whitmore's been talking to the county sheriff?" Caleb went still. "About what?" "The girl," Frank said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "He's filed a formal complaint. Theft. Vagrancy. I don't know exactly what the charge is. Something. Sheriff Morrison's supposed to come out to your place sometime this week." Caleb set his hands flat on the counter and took a breath. "On the basis of what evidence?" "On the basis of Whitmore saying so, far as I can tell." Frank finally looked up. "I'm not saying it's right, Caleb. I'm just telling you what I heard because I figured you'd want to know before Morrison showed up at your door." "I appreciate that," Caleb said, and meant it, and picked up the hinge set and walked out. He sat in the wagon for a moment before he untied the horse. The cold was specific and clear, the sky the pale blue that Wyoming gets in November when all the moisture has been wrung out of it, and his breath came in even clouds, and he thought about Eliza standing in the main street in October, very still, in the dirt, while Whitmore pointed at her and smiled. He untied the horse and headed home. He told her as soon as he got in, before he'd even taken his coat off, because she deserved to know, and he'd made a habit of not managing information on her behalf. She was at the stove. Owen was on the floor in the basket, which he was nearly too long for now, his feet kicking against the side in a steady, contented rhythm. She kept her back to Caleb while he talked, and when he finished, she stayed that way for a moment, still, the spoon in her hand not moving. Then she turned around. "All right," she said. "That's all?" "What else is there to say right now?" Her voice was flat, not defeated. She didn't sound defeated. She sounded like a person conserving energy for what was coming. "I knew he wasn't done. Men like Whitmore don't stop because they're embarrassed in a street. They stop when there's nothing left to go after." "We'll talk to Morrison when he comes," Caleb said. "Tell him what you told me and what you told the crowd." "I've told the truth twice already," she said. "Twice is not a magic number." "We'll tell it again. Caleb," she looked at him directly, "you know how this goes. Whitmore has money. Money talks to sheriffs the way it talks to everyone else." "Morrison's not Whitmore's man," Caleb said. "I've known Morrison for 15 years. "Have you known him when he had to choose between you and Gerald Whitmore?" He didn't have an answer for that, and she saw it, and she didn't press, just turned back to the stove. The spoon started moving again. Owen kicked the side of the basket, happy with himself. The thing Caleb didn't say, the thing he turned over in his mind for the rest of that evening and into the next morning, was that he was afraid she was right. Not about Morrison specifically, about the general principle. He'd lived in this valley for 12 years and understood its machinery well enough to know that truth was a resource like any other. It had weight, but weight required something to rest on, and if the structure underneath shifted, the weight could go anywhere. Whitmore's structure was money and position and 15 years of accumulated favor. What Caleb had was a reputation for straight dealing and a woman whose story he believed completely but couldn't prove. He fixed the north wall on Wednesday while he thought about this. Physical work had always helped him think. The repetition of it, the concrete problem of nail and board and level, the way your hands could be busy while your mind worked something else through. He drove nails and thought about Holt, the foreman. Eliza had said Holt was dead. She'd mentioned it in the street that first day, that the accusation against her had been constructed to cover his behavior. If Holt was dead, there was no one to contradict Whitmore's version of events except Eliza herself. Unless. He drove the last nail, checked the board for level, and went inside. "Eliza," he said, "were there other people at the Whitmore ranch? Workers, housekeepers, people who would have seen how Holt operated?" She was nursing Owen through his midday feeding, which she did with a practical modesty that Caleb had long since stopped noticing. She looked up. "There was an older woman," she said. "Vera. She'd been with the Whitmore household for years. She kept the accounts." "Did she see what happened, or what Holt was like?" Eliza thought. "She saw things," she said carefully. "She was careful about what she said and who she said it to. Vera was the kind of person who keeps her head down because she's learned that's how you keep your job. Where is she now? I don't know. She was there when I left. That was 6 months ago. A pause. Caleb, even if she's still there, she's not going to contradict Whitmore. She works for him. Maybe she does, he said. Maybe she doesn't anymore. He didn't know why he felt certain about this. It was less certainty than instinct, the sense that Vera, whoever she was a thread, and that threads sometimes led somewhere. He'd worked the land long enough to understand that you pull the thread available to you and see what comes. He wrote a letter that evening. He wasn't sure who to address it to. He didn't know Vera's last name, so he addressed it to Vera, formerly of the Whitmore household, at the Whitmore Ranch address, and wrote in plain language that he was trying to locate her regarding a matter of some urgency concerning a woman named Eliza Rowan, and that he would be grateful for any correspondence. He mailed it on Thursday from Harder's Crossing. He had no particular faith it would reach anyone or that anyone who received it would respond, but it was the thread available to him, and he pulled it. Sheriff Morrison came on Friday. He was a broad man, Morrison, with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read rooms before entering them. He came alone, which Caleb took as a positive sign, and he tied his horse at the post and knocked at the door with the manner of a man who is doing something he'd rather not be doing. Caleb let him in. Eliza was at the table. Owen was in the basket. She'd dressed carefully that morning, which Caleb had noticed without commenting on. A deliberate effort to look respectable and settled, the way you dress for a kind of audition where the audience has already been given a bad review of you. Morrison sat down at the table. He accepted coffee. He did not look at Eliza immediately, which told Caleb he was embarrassed about the nature of the visit, which told Caleb he wasn't fully committed to it. "You know why I'm here," Morrison said. "I do," Caleb said. "Whitmore filed a formal complaint. Theft of household funds, $42. He's requesting Morrison paused, adjusted his weight. "He's requesting Eliza Rowan be brought in for questioning." "Questioning," Caleb repeated. "That's the word he used. And you came out here because I wanted to hear the other side of it before I did anything else," Morrison said, and now he looked at Eliza directly. "Miss Rowan, I'm going to ask you to tell me what happened at the Whitmore Ranch, and I want you to take your time and not leave anything out." Eliza told him. She had told this story twice now, to the crowd in the street, to Caleb in the wagon on the way out here. And by this telling, it had a different quality, the quality of something worn smooth, the unnecessary parts gone, just the sequence of events in plain language. Holt, his demands, her refusal, the accusations that followed, being put off the property with her wages owed and her reputation destroyed. Morrison listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The foreman, Holt, he's dead," he said. "Yes." "When did he die?" "I don't know exactly. I heard about it from a traveler passing through about 2 months after I left the ranch. He'd gotten into a fight somewhere. That's all I was told." Morrison turned his coffee cup on the table, around and around. "You have any documentation? Any record of the wages owed? Any correspondence? Anything in writing?" "No," she said. "I had nothing when I left." "Anyone at the ranch who could corroborate?" She hesitated. "There was an older woman, Vera. She kept the household accounts. She would have known what those accounts actually showed." "You know her full name? Where she is?" "Not her full name. I don't know where she is now." Morrison nodded slowly, still turning the cup. He looked at Caleb. "You believe her?" "Without reservation," Caleb said. "That means something," Morrison said. "You're not a man who says things without meaning them." He stood up, put his hat back on. "I'm going to tell Whitmore I investigated and found insufficient evidence to proceed. That's going to make him unhappy." "I expect it will," Caleb said. "He'll push again. Men like Whitmore don't accept the first answer." "I know." Morrison looked at Eliza one more time. She looked back at him steadily. "You've been through something hard," he said. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more than I'm doing right now." "You listened," she said. "That's more than some." He nodded, put down his cup, and left. They heard his horse move off down the track, And then the silence of the ranch settled back around them, and Eliza let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding since he walked in, and then pressed both hands flat on the table like she needed something solid under her. "It's not over," she said. "No." "He said it himself. Whitmore will push again." "He will." She looked at him. "And your letter to Vera, even if she receives it, even if she responds, Caleb, I don't want you to count on that. I don't want you to build something on a person I can't guarantee." "I'm not counting on it," he said. "I'm trying everything." She looked at Owen in his basket. He was awake now, watching the ceiling with the absorbed attention he gave to everything that stayed still long enough for him to focus on. She watched her son. And Caleb noticed that he thought of it that way without hesitation now. Her son, the possessive applied without any of the qualification it would have had 6 weeks ago. And her face did the thing it sometimes did in unguarded moments, that complicated mixture of love and something that was almost pain, the particular ache of loving something that you're afraid of losing. He understood that too. The weeks that followed were the hardest stretch since she'd arrived. Not because of any single event, but because of the cumulative weight of waiting. The waiting for Whitmore's next move. The waiting to see whether the letter to Vera would produce anything. The waiting that had to be managed alongside the ordinary demands of a Wyoming November, which didn't stop because you had other things on your mind. Owen got sick in the 3rd week of November. Not the small cough from before. Something more serious. A fever that came on overnight and climbed to a height that scared them both. That had Eliza up through the night with wet cloths and careful watch, and that particular rigid calm that people put on when they're frightened and know that falling apart isn't an option. Caleb sat up with her the first night. Then she told him to sleep, that she'd call him if anything changed, and he lay in his room and listened to Owen's ragged breathing through the wall and understood in his body what it meant to have something to lose that you hadn't had before. The fever broke on the 2nd morning. Owen was limp and pale and exhausted, and Eliza held him against her shoulder for 2 hours straight without putting him down, and her face over his head was a thing that Caleb looked at and then looked away from, because it was too private to witness directly. Dorothy Crane came that afternoon with broth and her steady presence, and when she saw Owen she said, "He's through it. You can tell from the eyes when they're through it." Caleb believed her because he wanted to, and because she had seen enough of life to know what she was talking about. That same week, a man named Dale Porter, who ran cattle 20 miles north and stopped at Caleb's place occasionally for water and a rest on the way to and from town, came through and mentioned, in the offhand way of a man who doesn't know he's delivering important information, that he'd heard Gerald Whitmore was pushing for a town meeting. Caleb stopped walking. "What kind of meeting?" "Community meeting," Dale said. "Standing agenda. Moral character of the community. I think he's—" Dale looked uncomfortable. "I think it's about your situation, Caleb. The woman." After Dale left, Caleb stood in the barn for a while. A town meeting. That was the escalation. Whitmore had failed with rumors, failed with the sheriff, and now he was going to put it to a room full of people and use the momentum of community judgment to accomplish what individual authority hadn't managed. He went inside and told Eliza. She took it better than he expected, or at least she didn't show the worst of it. She listened with her hands in her lap and her face composed and then said, "When?" Dale didn't know the date. "But soon." "Probably." She nodded. "Then we'll go," she said. He blinked. "You want to go?" "I want to be there when people talk about me," she said. "I'm tired of the story of my life being told in rooms I'm not in." A pause. "And I'm not going to hide in this cabin like I've done something wrong." He looked at her for a moment. He'd said weeks ago, sitting in this same room, that he wasn't going to send her away because of what Whitmore implied. That was still true. But this was different. This was walking into the center of it, into a room full of people who had already been prepared to believe the worst about her, into a theater that Whitmore had constructed specifically. "We'll go," he said. She looked at him with that same awareness she'd had on the stove night, watching for signs of life. "You keep saying we," she said. "I keep meaning it." Something moved across her face. Not the almost smile. Something quieter and more serious than that. Something that cost her something to let him see. "I know," she said. "I know you do." The town meeting was announced for the second Friday of December, 3 weeks away. 3 weeks was enough time for the announcement to work its way through the valley and pull people in from as far as 40 miles. Whitmore had clearly applied the same organizational efficiency to this that he applied to his cattle operation. By the end of the first week, word had come back through Dorothy and Dale and Frank Adler that attendance would be significant. More people than usually bothered to come in from the outer ranches, which meant people were curious, which meant the story had grown in the telling, which meant whatever Eliza faced in that room was going to be larger and louder than what she'd faced in the street. Caleb's letter to Vera had not been answered. He hadn't expected it to be yet. Mail moved slowly in November, but the absence of a response was a weight he carried. He thought about this in the morning, saddling horses, doing the work that kept the ranch running. He thought, what do we have? He believed Eliza. Morrison believed her enough not to act. Dorothy believed her. But belief was not evidence, and a room full of people who had been primed by Whitmore's version of the story was not going to be moved by belief alone. What they had was her word and his. That was it. He thought, it might have to be enough. Eliza thought differently. He could tell because she went quiet in the second week, in the specific way she went quiet when she was working something through. Not withdrawal, just the particular internal focus of someone who is trying to solve a problem they haven't told anyone about yet. She'd disappear into the back room for an hour in the evening and come back with her expression slightly different, as though she'd put something in order. He didn't ask. He'd learned by now that she'd tell him when she was ready, and not a moment before. On a Tuesday, 13 days before the meeting, she came to him in the barn while he was working on the fence line repair. They'd lost a section to the freeze, and said, I need to write a letter. He looked up. To who? A man named Arthur Geddes. He was a traveling merchant who supplied the Whitmore Ranch with dry goods every 6 weeks or so. He made deliveries in the time I was there. She paused. He saw Holt. He saw Holt's behavior with the women workers. He was bothered by it. He said something to me once, just briefly, that he'd be a witness to it if anyone ever asked. Caleb put down the fence plier. You remember this man's name after 6 months? I remember every person who said they'd stand up for me, she said. I don't have so many of them that I'd forget. He felt that land. He let it. Write the letter, he said. I'll go to town tomorrow and send it by express. She nodded, turned to go back inside. Eliza? She turned back. Is there anything else you've been holding on to? He said. Because if there's a time to think about everything available, it's now. She was quiet for a moment. In the weak December light, her face was serious and tired and more real to him than it had ever been. This was what 6 weeks of shared difficulty did to the way you saw a person. It stripped away the early tentativeness, and you saw them as they actually were, the fine details of how they managed their fear, the particular way they held themselves when something was hard, the precise quality of their resilience. Vera kept a ledger, she said finally, a detailed one. Household accounts, wages owed, supply records. Everything in that house went through that ledger. She looked at him steadily. If Whitmore claimed $42 was stolen from the household accounts, it would be in that ledger exactly how it went missing, or exactly how it didn't. You think Vera would still have it? I think Vera kept records the way some people keep water, she said. Like, you might need it someday. He thought about his letter to Vera, unanswered in the mail. He thought about 3 weeks in express post and the distance between this valley and the Whitmore Ranch, which was not far in miles, but might be very far in a woman's willingness to put herself in the middle of something dangerous. We can only ask, he said. We can only ask, she agreed. The cold that descended that week was the serious kind, the kind that meant business, the kind that got into the cabin walls no matter what you did and required the stove to run almost continuously. They burned through wood faster than Caleb had planned. He cut more, came in at night with his shoulders aching, ate whatever Eliza had made without particular attention to what it was, and slept the sleep of a man being slowly ground down by difficulty. Owen, recovered from his fever, was undeterred by any of this. He had discovered that he could make a specific sound with his lips that made Eliza laugh, and he worked this discovery with the focused dedication of a scientist who has found a reliable result and intends to reproduce it as often as possible. The sound and the laugh that followed it became a fixed point in the day. something that interrupted the weight of everything else, and insisted, briefly and stubbornly, on existing alongside it. That was the thing about a baby in the house, Caleb thought. It refused to take the larger troubles seriously. It had its own schedule, its own demands, its own complete indifference to the things that were consuming the adults around it. There was something that wasn't quite comfort in that, but was in the same neighborhood. 3 days before the town meeting, a letter arrived. It was not from Arthur Geddes. It was not from Vera. It was from Gerald Whitmore himself, addressed to Caleb Ashford, and it was brief and direct in the way that men with lawyers write letters when they want to make clear what their lawyers could do without actually using a lawyer. Caleb read it at the table. Eliza sat across from him, watching his face. He read it twice. Then he put it down between them. She read it. Her expression didn't change much, but her jaw tightened slightly, the small tell she had when something was costing her effort to receive calmly. The letter said, in the language of forced civility, that Gerald Whitmore's patience with the current situation was exhausted, that he had given Caleb the opportunity to handle this matter privately, that he was prepared to bring documentation to the town meeting that would settle the question of Eliza Rowan's character definitively, that he trusted Caleb would make the appropriate decision before then, for the sake of his son and his own reputation. There was no specification of what the documentation was. There was no specific demand stated, but the shape of it was clear. Send her away before Friday, or face what Friday would bring. Caleb picked up the letter, walked to the stove, and put it in. Eliza watched the paper catch. "Well?" she said. "Well," he said. Owen made the sound with his lips. Neither of them laughed, but neither of them looked away from each other either, and in the fire behind the stove grate, Whitmore's careful language turned to ash as fast as anything else. Friday was coming. Whatever documentation Whitmore had or claimed to have would be in that room. And Caleb had no letter back from Vera, no confirmation from Arthur Geddes, no evidence except a woman's word and his own belief in it. It would have to be enough, or it wouldn't. He wasn't going to know which until they were standing in that room. The morning of the town meeting, Caleb woke up before the stove had warmed the cabin and lay in the dark listening to the silence with the specific alertness of someone who has slept poorly and knows it. He'd gone to bed at a reasonable hour. He'd lain there for 2 hours watching the ceiling. Somewhere around midnight, he'd gotten up, added wood to the stove, checked on Owen, sleeping, arms flung wide the way he slept now, taking up more of the world with every passing week, and stood in the doorway to the main room where Eliza had left her shawl folded on the chair back. And he'd thought about Friday in the way you think about something you can't change the approach of, which is to say, uselessly, in circles, arriving nowhere. He'd finally slept around 2 in the morning and woke at 5, feeling like he'd been assembled in the dark by someone working from a poor description. He got up, started the stove, stood at the window for a while, watching the December dark thin out at the edges into something gray and cold and absolute. No snow overnight, which was good. The roads would hold. Eliza came out of her room already dressed. He turned around and she was there, her hair properly pinned, wearing the dark blue dress that was her best. Not fine, not the kind of thing you'd call handsome in a town where women had fine things, but clean and well-kept and worn with a kind of deliberateness that said, "I chose this carefully." She looked at him, assessed his expression in the efficient way she had, and said, "Did you sleep?" "Some." "Me too," she said. "Some." They ate breakfast without talking much. Owen was still asleep, which was unusual for him. He had the internal clock of a small rooster, as a rule. But the cold seemed to have convinced him to stay under his blankets, and neither of them moved to wake him. Dorothy Crane was coming at 8 to watch him for the day. That had been arranged 3 days ago, Dorothy offering without being asked, in the matter-of-fact way she handled most things. "Whatever they say today," Caleb said, into the quiet of the second cup of coffee, "I want you to know it doesn't change anything. At the ranch, what we've built here." Eliza looked at him across the table. "You don't know what they're going to say." "Doesn't matter." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You're stubborn," she said. "I know. It's not always a useful quality. I know that too." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but he could tell it was close. Then she looked out the window at the gray morning, and the almost smile went away. "I've been through rooms like this before," she said, "where everyone already knows what they think, and they're there to see it confirmed. You learn to... She stopped, started again. You learn to find one person in the room to look at, one person who's still actually thinking, and you talk to them, not the room, just that one person. A pause. That's the only way I've gotten through rooms like this. Today, he said, you won't have to find one person. You'll have me, and you'll have Dorothy. She looked back at him. Dorothy's staying with Owen. Dorothy told Roy McAllister yesterday that if he didn't keep an eye on Owen for 2 hours, she was going to say in public what she actually thought of how he'd handled his counter service since 1879, and Roy apparently agreed immediately. He said this without elaboration. Eliza stared at him. She did not. Dorothy is not a woman who bluffs. This time the smile made it. Just briefly, just barely. A real one. The full-face version. The kind she almost never let out without a fight. It lasted about 3 seconds before she pulled it back under control. But he'd seen it, and that felt like something worth carrying into what was coming. Dorothy arrived at 8 with her good coat on and an expression that said she had decided something and was not interested in revisiting the decision. She looked at Eliza, looked at Caleb, took Owen from Eliza's arms with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own, and said, "Go, and don't let that man put words in your mouths." They went. The road to Harder's Crossing took 45 minutes in the wagon. They didn't talk for most of it. The cold sat on everything with its particular December weight, and the horse's breath made small clouds, and the frozen mud under the wheels gave the ride a specific rattling quality that discouraged conversation anyway. Caleb watched the road. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap, not fidgeting, doing the internal preparation she did, the one he'd learned not to interrupt. Halfway there, she said, "Whitmore's documentation." "What about it?" "I've been thinking about what it could be." She looked at the road ahead. "He said he'd bring documentation that would settle the question of my character. He didn't say evidence of the theft. He said character." "You think they're different things." "I think he doesn't have evidence of the theft because there isn't any, but character, that's different. Character can be assembled. Statements from people at the ranch who'd say what he told them to say, records that are real but presented in a way that implies something they don't actually prove." She paused. "He's not going to prove I stole $42. He's going to make a room full of people feel like the kind of woman who would." Caleb thought about this. "Then what do we do with that?" "Tell the truth in a way that can't be misread," she said. "No details left out. No softening to avoid embarrassment. Everything Holt did, everything Whitmore did, in plain language that doesn't leave room for alternative interpretations. That means saying things in front of a room that are personal." "Yes," she said. "You're ready to do that?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not ready," she said, "but I'm going to do it." He nodded. That was the most honest answer, and he'd learned to respect her honest answers, even when they weren't comfortable. The meeting hall in Harder's Crossing was a single long room attached to the side of the town's oldest building, used for everything from storage in summer to occasional dances to exactly this kind of gathering. It held maybe 80 people if they stood. By the time Caleb and Eliza arrived, it was already close to that. Wagons lined the street outside, horses tied at every post, and the sound from inside had the particular low murmur of a crowd that is waiting for something and talking about it while it waits. They went in. The talking didn't stop exactly. It changed. The way sound changes in a room when the subject of its conversation enters. A shift in frequency, people becoming aware, elbowing each other, the murmur moving in a new direction. Eliza walked in ahead of him by half a step. He didn't know if she'd done it deliberately, but he thought she probably had. Getting into position first. Establishing that she was here, she was standing, she was looking at this room and not away from it. Gerald Whitmore was at the front of the room, beside a long table. He had 2 men with him that Caleb didn't know, not local, and a leather case on the table in front of him. He saw Caleb and Eliza come in, and his expression did something that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite satisfaction, but occupied the same territory. The expression of a man who believes the board is arranged the way he needs it. Ray Dobbins was running the meeting. He was at the podium with his town council authority, and his expression of a man who would rather be absolutely anywhere else, which Caleb thought was at least honest. Ray called for quiet, and the room mostly gave it, and he went through the formalities of a community meeting with the efficiency of someone who wants to get to the part they can't control and get it over with. Then he gave the floor to Whitmore. Whitmore stood up. He was good at this. Caleb gave him that. He had the ease of a man who'd spoken to rooms all his life and found them obliging. He talked about community standards. He talked about the responsibilities of property ownership and the importance of moral character in a valley where people depended on each other. He built his case the way a good carpenter builds a frame. Foundation first, then the uprights, then the structure that makes it all hold. Then he opened the leather case and took out a folder of papers. He had 3 signed statements from workers at the Whitmore Ranch, men whose names Caleb didn't recognize, attesting to Eliza Rowan's carelessness, dishonesty, and general poor character. He had a household account summary showing a $42 discrepancy in the period when Eliza worked there. He had a letter from a woman in Colorado. He said it was a letter from a woman who had employed Eliza before and had similar experiences, which he read a portion of aloud, the portion that described Eliza as unreliable and prone to inventing grievances. The room listened. Caleb watched it listen. He could see the weight of it settling on people. Not conviction, exactly, not in most faces, but doubt, which was all Whitmore needed. Doubt was enough. Doubt in a room this size, aimed at a woman this visible, would harden overnight into something that functioned identically to certainty. Eliza stood beside him and said nothing. He could feel the effort of that in the stillness of her, the contained quality of it. When Whitmore finished, Ray Dobbins asked, with the careful neutrality of a man trying to maintain the appearance of a fair proceeding, whether Miss Rowan would like to respond. She walked to the front of the room. She stood there for a moment without speaking, which was a choice. Caleb watched the room watch her, and something in the quality of the attention shifted slightly. The difference between a crowd waiting to dismiss someone and a crowd that isn't entirely sure yet. Then she talked. She started with the letter from Colorado. She said the woman named in that letter, a Mrs. Harriet Combs, had let her go when she was unable to continue working because of a fever that had lasted 3 weeks. She said she had a letter from Mrs. Combs written at the time of her departure that specifically thanked her for her work and wished her well. She reached into her coat pocket, and Caleb, who had not known about this, went very still and produced an envelope, which she held up. "I kept it," she said to the room, "because I've learned to keep things. Because I've learned that what people say about you when you're present isn't always what they say when you're not." A murmur through the crowd. Whitmore's expression adjusted slightly, the way something adjusts when it has been unexpectedly disturbed. Then she talked about the household accounts. She said the discrepancy Whitmore had identified was real. She said it had been real when she worked there. She said she had brought it to Holt's attention because she was responsible for certain purchasing and wanted the accounts to reconcile. She said Holt had told her it was handled. "I didn't steal $42, she said. "I reported a discrepancy and was told by the man responsible for the accounts that it was handled. 2 weeks later, I refused that same man's demands about something that had nothing to do with money. 3 days after that, I was accused of theft and put off the property." She stopped. Let the room sit with it. "I know how this sounds," she said, and her voice was clear and even, and Caleb thought, she's talking to the one person who's still thinking. She's doing exactly what she said she'd do. "I know I'm standing here with nothing but my own word, and Mr. Whitmore is standing over there with a folder full of papers and the goodwill of this valley behind him. I know which of us this room is more comfortable believing." Complete silence. "What I'm asking you to consider," she said, "is what kind of woman would do what I'm accused of, and then, instead of disappearing, walk into this valley and stay. Stay for 2 months, work every day, care for a child, live where everyone can see her." She looked at the room. A woman who stole from her employer doesn't stay where she can be found. She runs. I didn't run. I stopped running. That's the truth, and I can't make you believe it, but I can stand here and say it to your faces. The silence held for another moment, and then broke into the uncertain collective sound of a room that has received something it didn't expect and doesn't know what to do with. That was when the door at the back of the hall opened. Caleb heard it before he saw it. A draft of cold air, the creak of the old hinge, the sound of boots on the floor. He turned around along with half the room. An older woman stood in the doorway. 60 or so, with a heavy coat and a carpet bag and the expression of a person who has traveled some distance and arrived with a purpose. She looked around the room until she found Eliza, and when she did, her expression changed into something that was not quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. "I'm sorry I'm late," the woman said to the room, to no one in particular. "The road from the Whitmore Ranch is longer than it used to be." Whitmore moved. He actually moved, stepped forward, and said, "Vera," in a tone that was precisely calibrated between warning and demand. Vera looked at him. Just looked at him. The look of a woman who has worked for someone for 12 years and has made a calculation about what that's worth and what it isn't worth. "Sit down, Gerald," she said. And then she walked to the front of the room. Her name was Vera Halston. She had been the housekeeper and account keeper at the Whitmore Ranch for 12 years. She confirmed this for the room in the clear, direct voice of a woman who had managed household operations for over a decade and was accustomed to being precise. She had received Caleb's letter, she said. She had received it 3 weeks ago and had spent those 3 weeks thinking about what to do with it. She had not answered because she was not sure she had the courage to do what needed to be done. She was being honest about that. She was 61 years old and had no other employment and limited savings, and Gerald Whitmore's displeasure was not a small thing to absorb. She had come anyway. She reached into her carpet bag and produced a ledger, dark cover, worn spine, the kind of ledger that gets used every day for years. She opened it on the table where Whitmore's folder still sat. The $42 discrepancy, she explained to the room, was in the ledger. She had entered it herself. It was a payment made by the foreman Holt to a supplier who had later been identified as fraudulent, a supplier that Holt had invented in order to extract money from the household accounts for his own use. Eliza Rowan had noticed the discrepancy and reported it. Holt had told her it was handled because he needed time to cover his tracks. When Eliza refused his other demands and he needed to destroy her before she could say anything more about the accounts, the accusation of theft was the cleanest available tool. Vera turned the ledger to the entry in question and held it up for the room to see. The entries were there, dated in Vera's handwriting, methodical and irrefutable. Every correction, every note, the original entry and the subsequent cross-reference to Holt's fraudulent supplier. The ledger told the story more clearly than any speech could because numbers written in ink don't adjust themselves to match whoever's telling the story this week. The room was absolutely silent. Whitmore said, "That ledger is private property." "It is," Vera agreed. "It's also the truth." She looked at him with the calm of someone who has already paid the price of this moment in advance and accepted it. "I kept copies of every page before I left, Gerald. If that ledger disappears, the copies don't." She closed the ledger. She looked at Eliza. "I should have said something when you were still there," she said. "I didn't. I was afraid of losing my position. You lost yours instead." She paused. "I'm sorry for that. I should have been braver." Eliza looked at this woman who had not helped her when it mattered and had come to help her now when it cost something real, and she looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, "You're here now." It was the only thing she said to her, but it was enough, and both women knew it. The room erupted. Not immediately. There was a moment where everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to be the first to react, and then several people spoke at once, and Ray Dobbins tried to call for order and partly succeeded, and Whitmore said something to one of his men in a low voice that Caleb couldn't hear, and Sheriff Morrison, who had been standing at the side of the room the entire time, Caleb hadn't noticed him until now, moved away from the wall and toward the center with the unhurried authority of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment. Morrison looked at Whitmore. He said, "Gerald, I'm going to want to speak with you this afternoon about this ledger and what it says about where that $42 actually went." Whitmore's face did several things in rapid succession. The smile was long gone. "This is a community meeting," Whitmore said, "not a legal proceeding." "No," Morrison said, "but what's in that ledger might make it one." He looked at Vera. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay in town today." "I plan to," Vera said. Morrison nodded, looked at Caleb. "I think we're done here." Ray Dobbins, who looked like a man who had just been rescued from something he'd agreed to without fully understanding its dimensions, banged his gavel and said the meeting was adjourned, and the room's orderly dissolution began with the specific chaos of 80 people all processing the same unexpected information in different ways simultaneously. Caleb reached Eliza through the moving crowd. She was standing still in the current of people moving around her, the way she'd stood in the main street in October. But it was entirely different now. Then she'd been standing still because she had nowhere to go. Now she was standing still because she'd decided to. He stopped beside her. She looked at him. "You wrote to Vera," she said. "I wrote to Vera," he said. "I didn't know you'd written to her." "I know." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want to give you something to hope for that might not come through." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her face that he'd seen before in glimpses, but not like this, not this directly and completely, the full weight of something she'd been careful not to let him see. Not gratitude. More than gratitude. Something that had been building for 2 months out of shared meals and cold mornings, and a sick baby and burned eggs and a stove kept running, and a porch railing fixed, and all the small, unglamorous accumulations of 2 people surviving something together. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Thank you." 2 words, short, completely insufficient for what they had to carry. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them said anything else about it because it was that kind of moment, the kind where words are just the visible part of something that's mostly underneath. Around them, the hall was still buzzing, still moving. Near the door, Whitmore was talking to his men in a voice too low to hear. Morrison was speaking with Vera, who had sat down and opened the ledger again. People who had come in this morning, prepared to watch a woman be driven out of the valley, were recalibrating, turning to each other with the expressions of those who have had their assumptions revised publicly and aren't entirely sure what to do about it. Frank Adler appeared at Caleb's elbow. "Hell of a morning," he said. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Vera Halston," Frank said, with the air of someone who has just decided to respect a person they previously hadn't considered. "I wouldn't have predicted her. Good for her." "Good for her," Caleb agreed. Frank moved off. More people stopped. Some of them spoke to Caleb, some of them looked at Eliza with expressions that ranged from apologetic to merely reassessing, and Eliza received all of it with a composure that Caleb could see was costing her something. Not because she was angry, but because having to receive apologies from people who should have waited before judging is its own kind of exhaustion. Purvis, the man who'd been talking about her outside McAllister's, stopped in front of them. He looked at his boots, then at Eliza. "I said some things," he said, "that weren't right. I didn't know all of it." "No," Eliza said. "You didn't." He nodded, which was clearly all he had, and moved on. It wasn't much. It was also what there was. They found a corner of the room and stood in it while the crowd sorted itself out, and Caleb thought about the letter he'd mailed with limited faith 3 weeks ago, and about Vera sitting at her kitchen table at the Whitmore Ranch reading it and spending 3 weeks deciding, and about the specific courage it takes to do the right thing at the right time, when the right time is also the expensive time. He thought about Eliza at 12 years old probably, or whenever it was she'd learned that you keep letters, that you keep evidence, that you hold on to the things people say when they mean them, because later there will be versions that contradict. She had learned this so young and so thoroughly that she reached into her coat pocket in front of a room full of hostile witnesses and produced the exact thing she needed. He thought, "I have been living with someone remarkable." He hadn't exactly thought it in so many words before, but it had been there, accumulating. Whitmore left the hall before the crowd fully cleared. He left with his men and his leather case, and without speaking to anyone except his own people. And the manner of his exit, quick, contained, no eye contact, told its own story about how the morning had gone relative to his plans for it. Morrison watched him go and then went to speak to Ray Dobbins. Caleb didn't feel satisfied by watching Whitmore leave. He'd expected to, but he didn't. There was too much left to resolve for satisfaction. Morrison still had to pursue whatever the ledger revealed, which would take time, and the Valley's opinion, while shifted, was not entirely settled, and Eliza's life here was still fragile in the way that new things are fragile. What he felt instead was a kind of loosening, a reduction in the specific pressure that had been building since Ray Dobbins had come to the fence post and said people were talking. The pressure wasn't gone, but it had dropped. An hour later, they were back in the wagon heading home. The December afternoon was already graying toward early dusk. The cold came back with the wind at their backs. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap the way she had on the way in, but the quality of it was different. The contained preparation quality was gone. She looked tired. Not the tired of defeat, the tired of a person who has held themselves together under pressure for an extended period and has finally been allowed to put some of it down. Owen would need feeding when they got back. Dorothy would be waiting. The stove would need building up. The evening would require all the same things evenings required. But they drove for a while in silence that had a different texture from the morning silence, and after maybe 10 minutes of the road unrolling in front of the horse, Eliza said, "Arthur Geddes wrote back." Caleb turned to look at her. "The merchant," she said. "I got his letter 3 days ago. I didn't say anything because I thought, if Vera came, we wouldn't need it. And if Vera didn't come—" She stopped. "I didn't want to tell you about a letter that might not be enough." He looked at her. "That's why you didn't tell me. You were protecting me from hoping." "Yes," she said. He looked back at the road. "We've been doing that to each other," he said. "I know." A pause. "We should probably stop that," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Probably." The horse moved steadily. The light came down the way December light does, without ceremony, just a general dimming of everything until the sky was the color of old iron, and the first stars were barely there if you looked for them. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "The ranch. What you said that morning, about not changing anything. Still true?" She nodded slowly, looking at the road. He watched her from the side, the set of her jaw, the careful way she was assembled even now, even tired, the particular quality she had of a person who has learned to carry things and has been carrying them so long she doesn't entirely know how to put them down. "I think," she said, "this might actually work." He thought about the burned eggs and the wet cloths, and the 3 in the morning, and Owen's first real smile, and the letter to Vera, and the porch railing, and the stew going cold while he looked at his son's eyes. He thought about what she'd said in the street in October, very still in the dirt, quiet and clear. "Let me stay. I'll raise your son." "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." They drove the last miles home through the December dark, and the lamp Eliza had left burning in the window found them before they could see the cabin itself. A small, warm point of light at the edge of the dark, which was the oldest and most reliable thing in the world. Something lit to bring someone home. Dorothy was still there when they got back. She had Owen on her lap and was talking to him in the low, unhurried way she talked to babies, as though they were perfectly reasonable people who simply hadn't learned the words yet. And Owen was watching her face with the focused attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. When the door opened and Caleb and Eliza came in, he turned toward the sound and his whole face reorganized itself into something that was unmistakably directed at Eliza. Not a polite acknowledgement, not simple recognition, but the specific and total brightness of an infant who has identified the person who means most to him and cannot contain what that means. Eliza crossed the room and took him before she'd even taken her coat off. Dorothy watched this without comment, but the expression on her face said everything she wasn't saying. She looked at Caleb. He looked back. Something passed between them that didn't need language. The acknowledgement of 2 people who have watched something develop and are quietly, privately certain about what it is. "How'd it go?" Dorothy said. Not a question exactly. More like an opening. "Vera Halston came," Caleb said. Dorothy's eyebrows went up. "Vera Halston from the Whitmore Ranch." "The same." Dorothy sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Well," in the voice of someone who has just received news that confirms a thing they suspected but didn't dare assume. "Good for her." That's what Frank Adler said. Frank Adler is occasionally right about things. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, looked at Eliza, who was standing at the window with Owen against her shoulder, still in her coat, cheek resting lightly against his head. "You holding up?" Eliza turned. "I'm holding up." "You look exhausted." "I am exhausted." "Good," Dorothy said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who considers accurate self-assessment a virtue. "Sit down and stay that way for an evening. I'll come by Thursday." She put on her coat, looked at Caleb one more time. "You did right," she said, and went out before he could respond to it. The cabin settled around the three of them in the way it did in the evenings. The stove ticking, the particular quality of indoor warmth after outdoor cold, Owen's small sounds. Eliza finally took her coat off, sat down in the armchair with Owen still in her arms, and just stopped. The composed quality she'd maintained all day, through the meeting and the crowd, and Whitmore's papers, and Vera's arrival, and the long drive back, came down like something she'd been holding at shoulder height and could finally set on the floor. She looked, for the first time in a long time, simply tired. Not performing anything, not managing anything, just a tired woman sitting in a chair with a baby who had fallen asleep against her, in a house that was warm. Caleb made supper. He wasn't good at it the way she was. He burned things at irregular intervals and had no patience for anything that required careful timing. But he'd been feeding himself for 34 years and could manage a serviceable meal when needed. He fried salt pork and heated the beans left over from 2 days ago and cut bread and put it on the table. And when he looked up, she was watching him from the chair with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Just watching. He put the food on the table. She put Owen down in the basket. He barely stirred, and came to sit across from him, and they ate the way they'd been eating for 2 months now, not always talking, not needing to. The silence between them long since converted from something watchful into something that was just the normal texture of two people occupying the same space. She ate about half of what was on her plate, and then stopped and looked at it and said, "Whitmore is going to lose more than the argument." Caleb looked up. "Morrison's going to find what's in that ledger. He's going to find that Holt was stealing from him for years, probably, and that Whitmore either knew and allowed it or didn't know and should have." She turned her fork over in her hand. "Either way, the county's going to have questions about his accounts, the kind of questions that follow a man like that for a long time. Does that matter to you? What happens to him?" She thought about it honestly, which was her way. "I wanted him to be wrong in public," she said. "That happened. What comes after?" She set the fork down. "He's not worth spending a lot of time thinking about. He never was. He was just an obstacle. A bad thing that happened to me that I had to get past. And Holt is dead," she said. "I can't do anything with that except be glad I got out when I did." She looked at Caleb levelly. "I know that's not a gracious thing to say. It's an honest thing to say. I'm better at honest than gracious." "I know," he said. "I don't mind." She looked at him across the table, and again there was that thing in her face, the thing she'd been more willing to let him see since the ride home, something warmer and less defended than her usual expression, like a room with the windows opened after a long winter. "Arthur Geddes' letter," she said. "I should have told you." "Yes," he said. She paused. "I've spent a long time not having people I could distribute the weight to. It becomes a habit, carrying it alone. Even when you don't have to anymore, the habit's already there." He understood this completely and personally. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." "So am I," he said. "We can work on it at the same time." She looked at him for a moment more, then picked up her fork and finished her supper, and he finished his. And Owen slept in the basket between them, and outside the December night pressed its full dark weight against the cabin, and found nothing it could get into. The weeks that followed the town meeting were quieter than any period since Eliza had arrived, which itself felt like a kind of testimony. Not peaceful exactly. Winter in Wyoming doesn't do peaceful, it does relentless. But quieter in the way that a room gets quieter after the source of a persistent noise has finally stopped. The thing that had been humming underneath everything, the threat of Whitmore and the pressure of the valley's judgment, and the specific weight of being seen and found wanting, that hum went down. Sheriff Morrison's investigation into the Whitmore Ranch accounts took most of December and produced results in the new year that were, by all reports coming back through Frank Adler and Dorothy and the general transmission system of a small valley, significant enough to keep Whitmore occupied with his lawyers for a considerable time. The formal accusation against Eliza was quietly withdrawn. There was no announcement about this, no public correction, No ceremony of any kind. It simply ceased to exist the way accusations do when the person making them has larger problems. Vera Halston did not return to the Whitmore Ranch. She went to stay with a niece in Laramie, and she wrote Caleb a short letter saying so and thanking him for writing first. He read it, then gave it to Eliza, who read it and held it for a while without speaking. She lost her position, Eliza said. She made that choice. I know, I want to make sure she's all right. They sent a letter to Vera in Laramie, just a brief one, saying they were grateful, saying if she ever needed anything, to write. Vera wrote back, eventually, weeks later, saying her niece's household was fine and that she was sleeping better than she had in years, which she offered without further elaboration, but which said everything that needed saying. Clara came in February. Eliza's younger sister arrived on the stage from Colorado on a Tuesday, which Eliza hadn't expected. She'd written to say she was coming, but the exact date had been uncertain. And Caleb came in from the barn to find two women in his kitchen, one of whom he knew, and one of whom was looking around his cabin with the specific comprehensive assessment of a younger sibling who is determining whether her older sister is actually all right. Clara was 20, with her sister's dark hair and a more immediately readable face. She hadn't yet learned to keep things internal the way Eliza had. She looked at the cabin, looked at Owen, looked at Caleb, and then looked at Eliza with an expression that went through about 6 different things in about 3 seconds. You look, Clara started. Tired, Eliza said. I was going to say different. Different how? Clara looked at her with the honest eyes of someone who has known this person their entire life. Settled, she said. You look settled. I've never seen you look settled. Eliza didn't respond to this immediately. Caleb, who was getting better at reading what her silences contained, thought this one contained something she didn't have a quick answer for because it had surprised her. This is Owen, Eliza said, which was an answer of a kind. Clara turned to the baby, who was sitting up now. He'd found his balance in January and treated this new ability with enormous self-satisfaction. And Owen looked at Clara with the evaluating stare he gave to new people, deciding what category she belonged in. Hello? Clara said to him. Owen reached toward her. Clara picked him up and looked at Eliza over his head with an expression that had stopped being complicated and become something simple. Okay, she said. Okay, I understand. She stayed a week. She slept in the back room. She and Eliza talked at hours that went past what was reasonable, their voices low through the wall, the kind of talking that sisters do when they've been apart long enough that they have real catching up to do, rather than the maintenance conversations of people who see each other regularly. Caleb could hear the cadence of it without the words. He didn't need the words. Clara helped with Owen and was good with him in a different way than Eliza was. More playful, less procedurally efficient, more likely to spend 20 minutes making faces at him when there was other work to do. Owen found this thrilling. Caleb found it quietly entertaining to watch Eliza watch her sister be irresponsible with the schedule she'd established. On the 4th day, Clara found Caleb in the barn and stood in the doorway watching him work for a while before saying anything. He noticed she was there but didn't rush her. People came to say things in their own time. She told me what happened, Clara said. The whole of it. The Whitmore Ranch, and then the street, and then you. He went on with what he was doing. All right. I need to say thank you, Clara said, because she won't say enough about it herself. She'll say you were fair and you gave her work and that was all she needed. But I know her and fair and work is not... She stopped. Started again. She wrote to me in November, one of her letters. She didn't say anything directly because she doesn't, that's not how she is, but I could tell from the way she wrote about Owen that I could tell it wasn't just a job to her anymore, if it ever was. Caleb set down the tool he was holding. It wasn't, he said. Not from the start, I don't think. No, Clara agreed. That's how she is. She doesn't do things partway. A pause. She's been hurt before, by people who took her in partway. I know. Do you? He looked at the younger woman, woman, who had her sister's directness without her sister's practiced containment. I know, he said again. and meant it in the fullest way. Clara looked at him for a moment, doing that assessment he'd seen when she walked in. Then she nodded once, the way someone nods when they've decided something. "All right," she said, and went back inside. The night before Clara left, the four of them, Caleb and Eliza and Clara and Owen, sat around the table after supper. And it was the first time Caleb had sat at that table with something that had the shape of a family around it since the 8th of October. He noticed this. He noticed it carefully, the way you notice things you don't want to lose track of. Clara and Eliza were talking about their mother, a woman Caleb knew nothing about, and the specific way she'd made biscuits wrong, some technique that both daughters had strong opinions about, and it was the kind of conversation that had no stakes and enormous warmth, and Owen kept interrupting by banging his hand on the table, which he'd discovered he could do and which produced a very satisfying sound, and everyone kept stopping to acknowledge his achievement and then continuing. And at some point, Caleb realized he had said almost nothing for 20 minutes and was nonetheless completely present, completely part of it. Not a man at the edge of someone else's warmth, but inside it, in the room, at the table. He didn't say this. There were no words for it that wouldn't have been too large for the moment. He just stayed there, at his own table, with his son banging on the wood and someone else's laughter in his house, and let it be what it was. Clara left on a Thursday. She held Owen for a long time at the door, and Owen bore this with the patience of an infant who has been held by enough people now to understand that being held is generally fine. She hugged Eliza in the unguarded way of someone who doesn't manage their affection for public consumption, and Eliza, who normally received everything at arm's length, at a slight angle, held her sister back without any of her usual restraint. "Come in the spring," Clara said into her sister's shoulder. "We will," Eliza said. "We." Caleb heard it without remarking on it, but he heard it. After Clara's stage disappeared down the road, Eliza stood at the gate for a moment. He stood beside her. The February air was raw and the sky had the flat white quality that meant snow was considering its options. "She liked you," Eliza said. "I liked her," he said. "She's easier to read than I am." "Most people are easier to read than you are." She glanced at him sideways. "Is that a complaint?" "Observation," he said. She looked back at the empty road. "I'm getting better at it," she said. "Being read." "I know," he said. "I've noticed." The snow came that afternoon and kept on through the night, and by morning the valley was under a foot of it, the particular clean, undisturbed white of a fresh Wyoming snowfall that makes everything look like it has been simplified down to its essential shape. Owen stood at the window in Eliza's arms, looking out at it with enormous eyes, making sounds that were close enough to words now that you could almost hear what they were going to be. It was on a morning in early March, ordinary in most other respects, that it happened. Eliza had Owen on the floor of the main room showing him something, a wooden spool of thread that he found compelling, turning it over and handing it back and turning it over again. She was talking to him while he did this, the low ongoing conversation she had with him that required no response, the way she'd been talking to him since the first night. Caleb came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots, and Owen looked up at the sound of the door, and his face did the thing, the brightness, the total reorganization of expression. And he lifted both arms toward Eliza because the sound of the door always meant Caleb had come in, and Caleb coming in meant Eliza would pick him up. Except this time, he didn't reach for Eliza. He reached, arms up, toward Eliza, and then turned his face toward Caleb, and then turned back to Eliza, and his mouth made a shape. "Mama," he said. Not a sound that resembled it, not an approximation. The word clearly, with the specific intentionality that separates a baby's first real word from the noises that precede it. Eliza went completely still. Owen, satisfied with this production, went back to the spool. Caleb stood in the doorway with snow on his boots and looked at Eliza's face. She wasn't looking at Owen anymore. She was looking at the middle distance. The way people look when something has happened that is too large to look at directly, that needs to be approached obliquely, given a moment to settle into reality before you engage with it. Her eyes were wet. She didn't do anything about this, just sat with it. "Eliza," he said. She shook her head slightly, not negating anything, just needing a second. Owen held the spool up toward her. He wanted her to take it so he could be given it again. This was the game. She reached out and took it automatically and handed it back, and he turned it over with satisfaction. "He said it," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "He said it," Caleb confirmed. She pressed her lips together, looked at the baby, looked at the ceiling briefly, in the way people look at ceilings when they are trying to get their face under control. Then she looked at Caleb. "I know I'm not—" She stopped. "I know it's not the same as Eliza," he said. She stopped. "You're his mother," he said. "That's just what you are. That's what you've been since that night in the street when you took him and he stopped crying. That's just the fact of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Owen banged the spool on the floor. The stove ticked. Outside, the March wind moved across the valley and found the cabin solid, the walls repaired, the door fitted right, the porch railing fixed months ago and holding. "Caleb," she said. Her voice had come back to itself. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." She looked at him with the full directness she had, the looking at things straight quality that had caught his attention the first day and hadn't stopped. "What are we doing here? Because I think I know, but I need you to say it." He crossed the room and sat down on the floor across from her, the way he sometimes did in the evenings when Owen was between them, because it was Owen's level and Owen seemed to prefer conversations where everyone was the same height. He looked at her. He was not a man who found words easy. Margaret had known this, had known how to wait for him, how to give him the space to find the right ones. Eliza also waited, not impatiently, just steadily, with the quality of someone who has learned that things worth knowing are sometimes slow in coming. "I think," he said, "that you came to my gate with nothing, and you gave my son a reason to stop crying. And then you stayed, and you gave me a reason to fix the porch, and write the letters, and sleep past 2 in the morning." He looked at her. "And I think I've been trying to figure out the right time to say that this isn't just arrangement, that it hasn't been arrangement for a long time. Maybe it never was." He paused. "And I think I've been slow about saying it because I was afraid of what it would mean to say it and have you not want the same thing." The silence was the good kind. "I want the same thing," she said. It wasn't flowery. It wasn't the kind of declaration that gets remembered and repeated for poetry. It was just two people sitting on a floor with a baby between them, saying the plain truth of it to each other, which was the only kind of truth either of them had ever really trusted. He reached across Owen and took her hand. She let him. Owen, finding this development uninteresting compared to the spool, went back to his investigation. They were married in May, when the valley had come back to something green and the morning smelled like everything growing again. It was a small ceremony by the oak tree at the east edge of the property, which had been there longer than anyone in the valley could remember and seemed therefore like a reasonable thing to stand under for something you meant to keep. Dorothy came. Claire had come back from Colorado for it and stood next to Dorothy with Owen in her arms, Owen wearing the small suit that Dorothy had made him, which he bore with limited patience and great dignity. Frank Adler came. Morrison came. Vera Halston had sent a letter that arrived the week before, short and warm, saying she was sorry to miss it and wishing them well. A handful of other people from the valley came, people who had been at the December meeting, some of whom had judged and some of whom had waited, all of whom had seen how it resolved and been changed by it in some degree. Not all of them were fully at peace with what they'd thought or said in the months before. Some of them would carry that quietly for a long time. That's how it goes with the things you can't take back. You live alongside them. Eliza stood under the oak in the blue dress that had been her best since October, and was still her best now, and she looked at Caleb with the full directness she always had, and he looked back at her the same way, and they said the things people say at these moments, the words worn smooth by centuries of use, and the words were fine, were enough, though both of them knew the actual thing had been said in much plainer language on a floor in March with a baby playing between them. Owen had fallen asleep in Claire's arms by the time the short ceremony was done, which everyone found appropriate. He had no idea what was happening. He would not remember this day. He would grow up with it already true, already the fact of his life, the way children grow up with facts they never had to build from nothing. They're just there, like the oak tree, like the valley, like the particular quality of a Wyoming morning that you know in your body before you're old enough to name it. He would call her Mama his entire life. It would never occur to him to call her anything else. Years later, not many years but enough, people in the Harders Crossing Valley who had been there for all of it would say different things about what the story of Caleb and Eliza Ashford was, what it meant, what it proved. Some said it proved that the truth comes out eventually, and it does, sometimes. Not always and not always in time, but sometimes. Some said it proved that a community has a responsibility to listen before it judges. And it does. Though communities being made of people will keep needing to learn this. Dorothy Crane, who is not given to easy summaries, said it didn't prove anything that wasn't already true. She said a woman walked through a gate with nothing and decided that here was worth staying for, and a man who was drowning decided to let her stay, and an orphaned baby got a mother, and the rest of it, the trouble, the accusations, the town meeting, all of it, was just what happened when people try to build something real in a world that's frequently skeptical about that. Caleb, if you'd asked him, would have given you something shorter. He would have said he fixed a porch railing in October, and that was the beginning of it. That's where he dated the turn. Eliza, if you'd asked her, would have said something true and slightly uncomfortable in the way her truths tended to be. She would have said, I was running for a long time before I stopped. Not because I found a place safe enough to stop, because I found people worth stopping for. There's a difference, and it matters. She was right. There is, and it does. The ranch ran. The seasons turned. Owen grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's capacity for silence, which was an interesting combination in a child and kept both of them on their toes. He was not an easy child. Neither of his parents had been easy people, and he came by his complications honestly. But he was a good one, the kind of good that comes from being genuinely loved rather than just successfully managed, which you can tell from the outside if you know what you're looking at. The oak tree by the east fence kept growing, the way oak trees do, without particular hurry, without any interest in being noticed. Every spring it came back, and every fall it let go, and every winter it stood bare and entirely itself, which is the most an oak tree can do, and also, when you think about it, quite a lot. The lamp in the window kept burning, the way it had since October, the way it would.